Hello, I'm Amanda Moore, the Director of the Clearinghouse Community. Welcome to our Advocacy Exchange for October 2016. The Advocacy Exchange is our monthly conversation with advocates advancing change. Both the Advocacy Exchange and the Clearinghouse Community are brought to you by the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, a national leader in advancing justice and opportunity. Today, I am joined by Ken Smith. Ken is a staff attorney with the Economic Justice Program at the Nebraska Appleseed Center for Law and the Public Interest, and he's joining us today from Lincoln, Nebraska. Hi, Ken.
Hello.
How are things in Lincoln?
They're great. Nebraska's 6-0, so
everyone's happy in town then. Excellent. Now, Ken, along with his colleagues, James Goddard, Becky Gould, and Tricia Thompson, wrote our current Clearinghouse article. It's called State Options in Expanding Access to Education in TANF Programs. You can find that article here on the Clearinghouse community. It's povertylaw.org/clearinghouse. And we're going to use that article as our starting point for our discussion today about what states can do to improve educational opportunities for TANF participants. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping matters to let you know about. First of all, we really want to hear from you. Ken is ready for your questions. We'd love to hear from you with those questions, or if you have experience in the subject area, let us hear about that. There are a couple ways you can let us hear from you. When you are watching through YouTube Live, you may very well see a chat box to the right of your screen. Go ahead and try that out if you want to. You can send us your questions. If you don't have a question yet, you can just send us your name and where you're watching. We'd love to hear from you. The other thing you can do is old tried and true email. So you'll see my email address on the screen. It's Amanda Moore, Moore, at povertylaw.org. So let us hear from you. Everyone who has registered for today's Advocacy Exchange will receive a follow-up email within possibly tomorrow, maybe early next week. That follow-up email will contain a couple of links. One will be to a recording of today's conversation, and this goes to everyone, even people who can't watch live today. So if your colleagues registered but couldn't make it, they'll still get this email and we'll be able to watch the recording. It will also contain the link to the article that Ken and his colleagues wrote. Oh, I see that we have someone who's let us hear from them. Chris in Denver is watching. So hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us today. Good to hear from you. Well, let's jump on in and talk about our subject at hand. So we'll start with the big overall picture here. So we're talking about TANF, that's Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. This is the cash assistance program that came out of welfare reform in 1996. Really, its goal is to get people off benefits and into the workforce. Some of us remember, and others of us have just read about, welfare to work being sort of the mantra of that time. Now, when we think about getting into the workforce, getting out of poverty, a lot of us think of education as one of the best paths to do that. So, Ken, if you can, explain to us what the structural barrier is in TANF that could keep participants from being able to pursue education.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, when Congress went through welfare reform in 1996, the perspective that was taken in replacing AFDC with TANF was a work-first approach. So the intent, as you said, was to move families off of cash assistance, move them into the workforce, and jobs, and was the way in which the jobs were the focus. That was the way in which that was obviously going to happen. And so just generally the way that work-first approach led to TANF being structured does not allow TANF participants to access education in a simple, straightforward way. And so educational opportunities are more limited than I think we would like to see. And kind of generally that's because to avoid financial penalties, states have to ensure that they meet federal work participation rate requirements. So just broadly, like a set percentage of able-bodied participants must be engaged in certain work activities. So since education was not considered a work activity through the work first approach taken to welfare reform, that just presents obstacles to TANF recipients who want to choose education as a means of fulfilling those work requirements. And I think, it seems that in 1996, I think I was in, I don't even know what grade I was in, but I was not following the big political movements of the country. But from just kind of reading about things after that time, I know that people have long regarded education, as you mentioned, Amanda, as a key in moving people out of poverty on a pathway to economic security. And I know that that was a big discussion at the time, and there was plenty of criticism of the work first approach that was taken. And I think what we've seen in the 20 years since welfare reform is that that need for education and how important, particularly post-secondary education, is to obtaining a good quality job has only grown. I think the work first model, and I think part of the problem with it is that it assumes that kind of holding any job can be a pathway out of poverty, when we know that many TANF recipients are working, but maybe caught in low wage jobs that don't provide financial security, that don't provide a pathway to self-sufficiency. And we also know of the growing skills gap. We know that a college degree is becoming the minimum credential that you need to get a basic entry-level job. And so those factors that made education important in 1996 obviously still exist. And I think there's plenty of data to suggest that the need for education in obtaining good quality jobs and getting on the path to self-sufficiency is only becoming more and more important in the years since welfare reform. So there are barriers to education within TANF. These are structural problems, and they come at a time, or at least we're now living in a time where post-secondary education and education in general is becoming increasingly important to transition people off of cash assistance and into good jobs and on the road to economic self-sufficiency, which was the intent of TANF from the very beginning.
Well, thank you for laying out that picture for us. So in Nebraska, you all have been able to figure out some ways to work within the system to make more opportunities for people to be able to take advantage of educational opportunities. And so we want to be sure we talk about that. That's the reason we're here today. So tell us how things work in Nebraska. What have you all been able to do to basically get around these barriers?
Well, and it's been kind of a long process, but generally, as with other federal programs, there are rules about how the program operates at a federal level, and then states are allowed certain discretion to implement the program in ways that make sense for their state. And so in Nebraska, our TANF program is called the Aid to Dependent Children Program, or ADC. And in order to be eligible for ADC in Nebraska, you have to participate in a program called Employment First. So Employment First has work requirements that follow the federal work participation rate, and requiring able-bodied adults to complete a certain number of hours of designated work activities. But Nebraska has been able to allow education and training activities to meet work requirements in excess of what is countable towards the federal work participation rate. So Nebraska as a state funds post-secondary education activities, other training opportunities for Employment First participants that are not claimed towards the maintenance of effort requirement that we have as a state, that all states have. And so then they're not subject to the more strict kind of federal TANF work requirements. So that permits Employment First participants in Nebraska to pursue longer training programs and educational programs that result in sometimes in better outcomes regarding income and employability.
So let me make sure that I understand this. So I think our viewers today are probably here because they already are familiar with TANF policy. So I'm not going to be too scared of getting into the weeds on this. So basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that participants in Nebraska still have to meet the work requirement, But Nebraska itself is funding anything beyond that that could be counted for education credits? I think I'm messing that up. Can you clarify that for me again?
Yeah. So because we had some flexibility because we were above sort of the target federal benchmark for the work participation rate. And so within that, we were able to make it so that more people could be participating in these employment and training programs without getting into a situation where we're not complying with the work participation rate and at risk of being sort of penalized for that.
I see. So the individual is able to, because the overall rate is high enough, certain individuals could pursue education without meeting these minimum work hour requirements?
That's right.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Appreciate that. This is not my previous area of practice, so I'm always trying to catch up with this. So this sounds like a great plan. How in Nebraska were you able to put this in place?
Well, it was through, I think, 10 years of pretty consistent work with our state lawmakers. There was a lot of time spent, talking to lawmakers about the need for increased access to education for ADC participants, how we would make that possible. And it really started with opening up access to post-secondary education as a core work activity. And then it moved on to things like increasing access to associate's degrees and certifications, and then ultimately to allowing participation in programs like adult basic education, a GED, or the equivalent, and then English as a second language. And so as of 2007, I think Nebraska transitioned ADC participants that were in some kind of post-secondary education program from TANF funds to a solely state-funded program. And so that's one way that sort of at the beginning it allowed for greater flexibility in providing employment or education and training services without having to deal with the federal work participation rates. And then in 2009, we passed a bill, LB 458, that allowed employment first participants to engage in vocational training, so something like an associate's degree, as a core work activity for 36 months. And that was a big step forward because before that, vocational education only counted as a core activity for 12 months. And so after LB 458 in 2009, post-secondary education could still be counted even after the 36-month period, but after that period, it would be counted as a non-core activity instead of a core activity. And then in 2012, we passed another law that allowed employment first participants that were 24 years old or younger to meet work participation requirements through adult basic ed or through ESL or through a GED program. And then the next year, we were able to pass a law that lifted that age limit. And then just this last legislative session, when there were those educational components were passed, they were passed with a sunset provision that was built into the statute. And so all of the progress that was made over the last several years was scheduled to come to an end this last year, but we were able to pass a law just in the last session that reauthorized all of those educational components and kind of saved them from sunsetting. So it was a process, that took the course of several years, and it was kind of incrementally just made these changes. But the result is that we have a pretty robust system where ADC participants can take advantage of educational opportunities across the spectrum, from post-secondary ed to basic ed, ESL, and hopefully then use that to increase their chances of finding a good job and finding a way to become self-sufficient.
Oh, great. Well, I want to remind our viewers, I imagine that several of you are watching and thinking, could we do this in my state? If you have questions, please let us hear from you. You can email me here at amandamoore@povertylaw.org, or you can contact us through the live chat box as you're watching through YouTube. It should be on the right side of your screen. If you're watching on a mobile device, I believe it's at the bottom of your screen. So we do have people watching from across the country. Some of them, maybe this is the first time they're thinking about this. Maybe some of them are already thinking about ideas they can pursue in their own states. In your article, you note that the advocacy opportunities on this front fall into two categories. One being increasing the access to education, and the second being implementing educational programming in a way that makes sense. So let's talk about those two advocacy opportunities in turn. We'll start with the first one. So what can advocates do in their states to increase access to education for TANF participants?
Well, I think there's a couple kind of key points to hit on here. And the one thing is it's helpful to determine whether you have, as a state, you have any flexibility in allowing education activities that don't count towards work participation rates. And so if your work participation rate is well above sort of the federal target, you may be able to allow more education as non-countable without having to deal with the penalties that come if you fail to meet that participation rate. And I think and I wasn't part of these legislative efforts, but one of the things that people were concerned about, and something that's important to keep in mind if this is a possibility in your state, is lawmakers in Nebraska were concerned that we could implement these educational programs because we were meeting our work participation rate, but then if economic factors changed and if all of a sudden we kind of had trouble meeting our work participation rate, we would probably have to face some consequences from that. And so we had kind of a safety valve built into the legislation, which provided that if the work rate kind of falls below where it needs to be, the educational programming can be suspended. So doing something like that, if you do have some flexibility there and there is room to push for more education activities, you can kind of alleviate some concerns about maintaining your work participation rate by building in a safety valve like that. So I think that is a good first thing that you can do, is determine how much flexibility your state has in doing this. I think, like Nebraska did in 2007, considering whether you can fund programs with state-only funding is another way. These would be state dollars that wouldn't count towards the state's maintenance of effort requirement, but can increase access to education broadly. And then the other thing is just, not ensuring that you're not sort of focusing on too specific of an educational program, but ensuring that educational activities include post-secondary education, but also things like adult basic education, GED or an equivalency, English as a second language. And you can also make sure that those activities presently count as non-core activities in your state. So those are a couple things that people could do just in terms of increasing access.
Great. We have a question that's come in. This is from Chris. Chris says, sorry if I missed this, but how do you determine who goes into the federal work requirement fulfillment pool and who gets access to the educational opportunities?
So Chris, if I understand your question, it's how do you determine which participants count towards the work participation rate versus participants that can take advantage of the educational opportunities?
I would read it that way. So you have a person is there a limit on how many people can be taking part in this educational opportunity? How do you decide? I mean, is someone coming in and saying, I want to go to school, then you say, no, you've got to go in this pool. I think maybe it's, and Chris, correct us if we're wrong.
Yeah. And
Chris says, yep.
Well, good. I'm glad. I think that's a good question. I think, the way that the work participation rate is calculated, I mean, I think that, and I'm not sure if this will adequately answer the question, but I think that the way that the work participation rate is calculated, so long as you're meeting that benchmark, I mean, there is no, I guess, limit on the amount of people that could be taking advantage of education opportunities. And so I think that it depends on how much flexibility you would have, you know, what your work participation rate is compared to what the federal standard is. But so long as you're above the federal standard, there wouldn't be sort of a limit. And if your question is about sort of real-time tracking, so how do we know with more and more people, you know, moving into educational activities that don't count towards the work participation rate, I guess I don't know how we do that, and I'm not sure what a good way of doing that would be. I think that's a good question.
We have another question that's come in from Don in New York, and I like this one. It's something I was wanting to ask about. Don says, maybe my ignorance, but I think of Nebraska as quite a red state where a work-first philosophy might still prevail. Did you have any special messages you brought to the legislature to help win folks over? He goes on and says, I'm in liberal New York, and our rules are not nearly as good, and we struggle to expand access to education. Last year, we did succeed in having four-year college become countable as work, but totally at a county option as to whether to allow it.
Interesting. So, I think this is Don from New York. I think you're exactly correct in your assessment of Nebraska as maybe being considered a red state. And it's not just the Cornhusker football team, but, you know, it applies to the way we approach a lot of political issues. And interestingly, and again, this was kind of before I was on the scene, but one of the champions in Nebraska, one of the lawmakers that really was instrumental in pushing for these changes was somebody who was more conservative, and he was an authority sort of within the community college system in Nebraska. So this person was very personally aware of the value of post-secondary education, and even specifically post-secondary education that was targeted towards different industries or employment opportunities in the state. And I think so finding somebody in a state like Nebraska that you know, that kind of represents that red state mentality, but understands how, as a policy matter, this is a very, you know, common sense thing to do, and then forming sort of a broad political coalition to push those reforms forward under the leadership of somebody that is kind of on the other side of the aisle, if you will, was one of the ways that we were able to do that. And so from the onset, from expanding, you know, in 2009 with LB 458, I mean, he was instrumental with that. And then that really laid the groundwork for then expanding that to beyond, you know, post-secondary ed, but to things like adult basic ed and ESL and the GED. So that's a really Nebraska-specific, you know, case-specific answer, but finding that one champion that is kind of from the other side of the aisle, or may not, you know, see, you know, all the issues in the same way that you do, was an important way for us to do that. I think another good, and I know we're gonna, in the report we talk about what other states have done, and I think Minnesota did a good job. They had a campaign, a named campaign, and if anyone's on the conversation from Minnesota, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but there was a named campaign called Prosperity for All when Minnesota was pushing to expand their access to adult basic ed and GED and ESL and post-secondary ed. And it emphasized all of the benefits that would accrue for pretty much everybody involved if these kind of common sense reforms took hold. And so, you know, it's not just good. It highlighted, and I think did a good job of highlighting, that these changes are not just good for, you know, people who are on cash assistance, but for their families, for employers in the state, for different industries in the state, for the state economy as a whole. And so if you have a broad coalition, if you can find a good champion kind of from the other side of the aisle. And then if you can highlight sort of the broadly felt benefits of promoting access to education for people on cash assistance, I think that's an effective way to push for those changes.
Thank you. It's a really interesting answer. Thanks for the interesting question, Dawn. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So if any of you viewers have a question, go ahead and get it to us now, either through the live chat on YouTube or to email me here, amandamoore@povertylaw.org. So let's pick back up where we were. So we were talking about two places with opportunities for advocacy. One that you already addressed on how to expand access to education. And the second one was on implementing this educational programming in a way that's effective for TANF participants. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, and there's a lot to cover there, but briefly, and this will overlap a little bit with access in one regard, but what some states have done, and a really good implementation tool, so ensuring that not only is there access to education activities and training programs for TANF recipients, but to ensure that they're implemented in a good way, and to make sure that they're as effective as they can be. There are a lot of good examples from around the country of education programming that are implemented with really good student support mechanisms, and so understanding the challenges that somebody from a low-income background may face when taking part in post-secondary education, for example. If these programs can be coupled with student support services, retention services, things like guidance about college registration, financial aid, things like that, and then on the career services side, making sure that there are mechanisms in place to facilitate kind of the transition from education into a job after education. So, resume workshops and other kind of career services components. That is, I think, a good way to ensure that the programs that you're implementing are going to be effective, down the road. I think partnerships with community colleges is another great way. I think I just talked about how community colleges were an important part of Nebraska's reforms. They seem to know, kind of have their thumb on the pulse of the state economy. They know, about transitioning people from post-secondary ed into a good job. So those institutions can, I think, be good partners in implementing good education programs. The other thing that some states have done really well is designing compliance requirements that allow for unanticipated obstacles. So having basic program eligibility requirements, time requirements, maybe grade point average requirements for education programs are necessary, but they should be accompanied with sort of an exceptions process. So it's not just sort of a one and done system. And then I think the final thing that I touch on is training caseworkers, making sure that caseworkers ensure that participants are aware of the educational options available to them. So even if you have all these programs that are available to people, they may not necessarily know that unless a caseworker tells them about it. Kentucky, I think Amanda's home state, actually requires caseworkers to make sure participants are aware of educational opportunities that may exist. So that's another great implementation tool that can improve the effectiveness of the education programs that you're able to implement.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the great questions from Chris and Dawn today. I want to thank Ken for joining us. It's been really interesting. And while I have everyone here, I want to remind you that you can read Ken and his colleagues' article, State Options in Expanding Access to Education and TANF Programs. You can find that at povertylaw.org/clearinghouse. The article goes into more detail about the things that Ken talked about today. And as he mentioned, with regard to Minnesota, highlights some programs in other states, in addition to Minnesota, also Arkansas and Maine. So if you have particular interest in those states, be sure to check out the article. I'll ask you if you're interested in these types of events, you can join our mailing list at povertylaw.org/join, and you can also follow the Shriver Center on LinkedIn. And while you're here, I want to invite you to join me for next month's Advocacy Exchange, Making the Case for Community Lawyering. I'll be joined by Taylor Healy, who is an attorney, and Aja Taylor, who's a community organizer. They both work at Bread for the City in Washington, D.C., and we'll talk about their experience working together and about how to make a community lawyering practice work. And that will be that will happen on Wednesday, November 16th at 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Pacific, same time as today's broadcast. And there'll be a link to register for that in the follow-up email that you'll get within the next few days. So I hope you'll be able to join us then. Until then, remember, you're not alone out there, and thanks again for watching today.